Welcome to the basic dent repair training video. This video is going to teach you the basic fundamentals of metal straightening used in auto body repair. First, before we start talking about metal straightening fundamentals, let's talk about why this is important for you to know. Let's say you're a brand new technician, you just entered the field, you're in a shop and the first job rolls in the door and it pulls into your stall. And it has some damage. Are you going to know what to do? Are you going to know the steps to take? What to do first? I mean, obviously you're going to see the damage there. Or are you going to know what the direct damage is, what the indirect, what to pull first or anything like that? I mean, you're the expert, right? You're the body man, the body technician. You're supposed to know these things, these basic steps. Now, we're not saying that you're going to know everything. In fact, you're going to go out there and you're going to learn for years to come. But you shouldn't have the basics down, and your employer is going to expect you to know these things. He's not going to want to take you by the hand and take you step by step through all the basics. However, if you have questions, I wouldn't hesitate to ask. But you're expected to know these things. So in this video, we're going to cover some of these basics. We're going to talk about the first things to do. We're going to talk about developing a repair plan so you have something to follow, a blueprint to follow. We're going to talk about some of the procedures for straightening metal, some of the tools used, direct damage and indirect damage, work hardening. And we're going to discuss these in this video, and hopefully at the end of this video you have an idea and a guideline of something to follow to help you achieve this. Now, luckily for you, if you're a student, your instructor is the expert at this point, and he's going to take you step by step and show you what to do and the steps to take. However, I encourage you to pay close attention to your instructor while in school, because he's going to help you. But once out there in the industry, they're going to expect you to know these things. The industry expects you to know the basics. All right, well, let's get started. Let's talk about repairing modern day cars. The metal, it seems like they keep getting thinner as the years go by. They have restrictions to improve miles per gallon, more composites. So the cars are being designed with a lot of different materials, a lot of different types of steels. We got mild steels, high strength steels, ultra high strength steels. So there's a lot of considerations, but we're going to focus on minor dent repair today. But it is important to know that these metals are thin, and we can't repair them the way we used to. We used to use body hammers and files and picks and metal finish the metal, but we don't have enough metal. It's not thick enough to allow us to do a lot of that metal finishing on modern day cars. So we've got some new tools that we use, and we're going to go through some of those tools to repair these cars. Another thing about modern day cars, you don't have a lot of access to both sides. For example, hammer and dolly. That works well. It's easy to use, but it's kind of hard to get a dolly back on the back side of a lot of these parts. So that's some things you need to consider when working on modern day cars, is that you have limited access, and the metal is real light, real thin gauge metal. However, I would like to mention to keep things simple. If you think of electricity, if lightning hits a house, it's going to follow the ground, the ground wire that's attached to the ground rod that's hammered into the ground. And the reason it does that is because it follows the path of least resistance. Whatever's the easiest way for it to follow, it's going to follow. So when you think of repairing damage, repairing dents, you need to think of it the same way. Whatever tool, whatever method works best for that specific dent. There's no dents exactly the same. And not every tool is going to work, the best on each dent. If on these thin metals, if you can get behind it with hammer and dolly, probably that's going to be the easiest method. In fact, some of these thin metals, if you can get your hand back there, you can work some of the damage out. Just because you got a high dollar dent repair system does not mean you have to use it on every dent. So just keep in mind, when we're repairing damage, try to think of what is the most simple method to use. And in fact, even if you are going to use some some dent removal tools, and this goes for heavier dents and even frame damage. Look at the damage and imagine grabbing it with your hands. Imagine you are strong enough to grab with your hands, and you'd think to yourself, I'm going to push here and I'm going to pull here, and probably that's going to be a correct method. That's probably what we would do. We just make the tools do that. So anyway, I just wanted to stress that before we get started on metal straightening is to just keep it simple. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. There's some things you want to do before you grab the tools and start working on dents. And if you'll follow these methods, it'll eliminate a lot of mistakes down the line, a lot of headaches. And it's a simple process. In fact, if you've ever been on a date, you can do this. When you go on a date, especially your first date with someone, I'm sure you do everything you can to be prepared. You shower, do your hair, your teeth and everything, so that when you go on that date, you can date with confidence. You know that everything is taken care of. Well, working on a car is the same way. Before you start repairing it, you want to clean it really good, get all them contaminants off of it, so that when you work on it, you can work on it with confidence without worrying about problems, silicones or anything like that. So be sure to wash really good before working on cars. Now this is something that's often overlooked, or they just don't do this step, but this will eliminate a lot of mistakes, a lot of paint failure problems, and also once you get the car good and clean, whenever you start developing your repair plan, which we're going to talk about in a minute, it helps you identify the dents a lot better. It's hard to see some of the dents on a dirty car. So anyway, before you start repairs, clean it really good, and that'll just make the job go a lot smoother. Okay, now we've got it all washed, it's clean, we've got all the waxes, silicones off, and now we can start the repair with confidence. We know that we're not going to have problems down the line. So now we can start identifying the damage, the extent of the damage, and determining what we need to do. And one of the things that you're going to need to determine is you're going to repair or replace the part. And this is going to take some experience and judgment to make these determinations, but here's a few steps you can follow to help you do that. The first most obvious question is, can the part be repaired? There are some parts that can't be repaired. They're damaged too severely. And if that's the case, of course you're going to have to replace the part. So what is considered too much damage? Well, there's a general rule of thumb. It's not set in stone, but if the part is kinked, that's where it's bent, on a small radius, over 90 degrees. So if it's kinked, it's going to be replaced. If it's not kinked, it's repairable. But this kind of falls into the, the experience and, the judgment. It's going to take some experience to kind of determine that. Is the part available? That's another question you can ask yourself. There are some vehicles out there that they don't make parts for anymore. However, they don't make aftermarket parts for them either. So if there's no parts available, you're not going to mind putting more time and labor into it to repair the part. Another thing is, what's it going to cost to repair the part? For example, if you're a shop and you charge $50 an hour and there's a 3-hour dent in a $100 fender, of course it's going to make more sense to replace the fender, because to repair it at $50 an hour would be $150. To replace it's going to be $100. So that it makes sense to replace it. However, what if you're a do-it-yourself at home or a student, and the labor's free? Well, you may not mind putting in more labor than it's worth, because the labor is not going to cost you anything. So that's kind of some different things to consider, and it's going to determine, like I said, if you're a shop doing this, charging labor, or if you're someone at your house restoring something. Kind of some variations there, but that'll kind of give you an idea. Let's start talking about developing a repair plan. Repair plan involves everything from just determining what all you need to do. Does that part going to be repaired or replaced? And also you need to determine the surrounding parts. What's going to have to be removed to repair or replace that part. What's going to have to be protected? You're going to have to protect your adjacent parts from being damaged. Are there any moldings or trim that has to be removed to make those repairs? Those are some of the things you want to start considering when developing your repair plan. Everything it's going to take to repair that. And you can start writing that down. It's a good practice, especially as beginning. Write it all down to the steps it's going to take to repair that from start to finish. Now, it may not always follow that just perfectly. You may find additional damage, hidden damage, things like that. But it's a good idea to have a good idea, a good blueprint of what you're going to do. So when developing your repair plan, just take the extra time to plan your work thoroughly. Plan your work, then work your plan. That'll save you a lot of time in the end. Now, one of the biggest tips I can give you, and this is an often overlooked step as well, is bagging your parts. This is a very important step. If you take a right front fender off, get all the bolts and hardware and put in a bag, and be sure and label it. Right front fender. That way, when you go put it all back together, it'll be there. And I know you may think that, I'm taking this apart today and I'll be putting it back together tomorrow. However, what if just one screw on the floor gets kicked or misplaced? You can spend hours looking for a screw or a nut or whatever, and it just drives you crazy. However, if you'll bag your parts, it'll eliminate all those problems. Now, there's a lot of clips on cars that sometimes get damaged, and you're going to have to replace those. But if you'll take just a little extra time to bag your parts, it'll save you a lot of time in the end. If you're doing a restoration job, this is a must. I mean, these cars aren't apart for a week or two. I mean, they may be 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, and if you don't have these labeled and bagged, you're going to have a hard time when it's time to put everything back together. So always bag your parts, no matter the size of the job. Another tip for you, whenever you're taking things apart, and this is especially important for restoration, take pictures. Everybody's got cell phones these days. It just takes a minute to take a picture, and that's a good reference point. If you have any issues when you're putting it back together, you can look at your pictures, and that will help you determine, what you need to do. But always bag your parts. Take pictures as you go, and that will really help you along the process. Another tip with your parts is to never throw your parts away. If you take that fender off, for example, and you get it off and go throw it in the scrap metal and it's hauled off, and you get the new one to go put it on, I mean, there may be a clip or a screw, or sometimes there's parts on there that you can't just run to the parts store and pick up. They're hard to find. You may need it as a reference, when you go to put the new one on. If it's an aftermarket part, you may need to see if there's something that you need to modify. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but it's a good practice to never throw the parts away until the job is completed and out the door. Another important thing to do is to protect your adjacent panels. And you can do this with 1.5-inch masking tape. Put a couple of layers of that on your adjacent panels that are not being worked on. I also make a thick Autobody tape you can use, but a couple layers of masking tape will work fine as well. And what this does, let's say you're working on a door, like in this picture, and you're close to an edge to the next panel, if you don't mask that panel off, you may accidentally sand with your 80 or 36 grit, even 400 can scratch the next panel and damage it. And this may require painting more than you originally intended to. This also goes for your trim. If you got a chrome trim or any type of trim or molding on there, if you accidentally hit it with a DA, you may end up having to replace that molding, and some of those parts are very expensive. So if you're going to be removing the parts, go ahead and do that at this point. And if not, you want to be sure that you protect them, with tape or some type of protective material like that. Another thing, glass. Glass gets pitted real easy by grinding and welding. And if the sparks hit the glass, the heat from it will make a little pit in it. And that's something that you don't want. And this can be eliminated by putting a welding blanket over any glass parts. So make certain that you do protect the adjacent panels, glass, moldings, and things like that. Also, if you're going to be taking a molding off that's around a damaged area, go ahead and do that before. I've seen it where kind of procrastinate. It needs to come off, but you're going to do that later, later down the line, and then end up damaging it and having to replace it. Well, if you're going to be taking it off, just go ahead and do it from the beginning. That way it's out of the way and you're not going to have to worry about it. Okay, we're back to this photo and we're going to talk about first in, last out. But after looking at that and you've got a few ideas of what to look for, what would you do with that quarter panel? Would you repair it or replace it? What repair methods would you use? Well, if it was a body shop, in my opinion, I think they would probably go ahead and replace that. I think the hours to repair it would cost more than it would do to replace. But we did this at a school, and of course the labor doesn't cost, so we decided to repair it. The job came out fine, looked good, but we did have a lot of hours in getting that straightened. The damages around that body line, and there's quite a bit of direct and indirect damage that we had to work out. Used different repair methods. We used hammer and dolly on some of it, used a stud welder gun on others, and on other areas, but it took quite a bit of labor to get that out. But anyway, just kind of wanted you to think about what would you do with that. Would you repair it or replace it, and what methods would you use? When you go to repair it, where would you start from? I often see students going right to the center of the damage and start pulling it out. You don't start at the center of the damage because that's going to stretch the metal and cause highs. And that's where this first in, last out rule comes. If you'll remember that rule, it'll save you a lot of time. Now what that means is whatever was first during the accident, the point of impact, that's your direct damage. That's going to be the last to come out. Your indirect damage follows the direct damage as it goes in. That's the last thing that's damaged. So that's going to be the first to come in. So remember the first in, last out rule and kind of follow that. And we'll talk more about that briefly. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about direct damage and indirect damage. Now, as we mentioned, direct damage is the point of impact. If two cars impact the exact places they impact, collide, that is your direct damage. You can see in this photo where the rip is at and that crease, all that's your direct damage. The two lower arrows is the direct damage. And then you see up by the lower body line and the upper body line, it's wavy in there, and that's going to be your indirect damage. The direct damage is very easy to see. That's the point of impact. That's the dent that you see. What you don't see sometimes is some of the indirect damage, and that's could be waves. It could even be cracks and seam sealer, pop spot welds. That's all indication of indirect damage. Now it's very important to identify the indirect damage because if you remember the first in, last out, that's where you're going to start. So in this case, this damage here, you're going to start with the upper areas. You're going to start pulling on the low areas up there to pull them out. And above the indirect damage around in that area, there's usually going to be some high areas because usually a dent just doesn't fall in like a hole or anything. As it's pushed in, it's going to cause it to bulge out somewhere. And that may not be real noticeable, but it's very important to find those areas because as you're pulling out, you're going to want to push in on those areas with whatever tools you're using. Let's say a hammer and dolly. You're going to want a dolly on the back side on the low area, and you're going to want to be tapping in on the high areas to repair this damage. Another thing to consider is work hardening. Work hardening is where the metal is harder than normal than it is in its relaxed state, and this can be caused during an accident when the metal is stretched or changes its original, the shape that it was. You're going to have some work hardening. Now, panels like this, they have a lot of body lines. You can see this in this picture, it has curves and body lines. That has a lot of work hardening from the factory. This was just a flat piece of metal, and it's stamped, and it puts these body lines and ridges in it and bows, and all those areas are work hardened. Now, if there's damage on one of those body lines, it's going to be harder to repair that than if it's just in the center of a panel. So whenever you're looking at the damage and you're determining what kind of repair methods you're going to use, this is something to keep in mind. Is it in a work hardened area? Did it cause additional work hardening? And that's going to add additional time to the what you may be considering the repair time to be. Now, once the damage has been analyzed, you've determined the direction of the damage and what the point of impact was, the direct damage and the indirect damage, and you have a good idea of what happened. Now you're going to start determining the repair method to repair this. What tools are you going to use? What's going to be the easiest method? To keep it simple. And also remember, like we just mentioned, you don't want to force the metal. You don't want to start in the low areas and just start forcing them out. What that'll do, that'll just pull highs in the low area, but you'll still have lows, and then your high areas that was high due to the accident that was bulging out, you're still going to have those, and this is going to cause a lot of problems when you go do your body filler work. You're going to have those little stretched high marks in them. You're going to put your body filler on, you're going to start sanding it off, and then you're going to have these little high spots all over. So it's very important to think about rolling the metal back to its place. I mean, metal has memory. It's just your job to help it go back to that shape. So just remember to think of it like rolling the metal, pushing down on that high area while you're pushing up on the low area, and putting it back where it should be. Try not to stretch the metal just by forcing it in the low areas. So probably one of the most common tools used for modern day cars. In the older cars used a lot of picks and bullseye pick and body files and hammers, because you could get to both sides real easy. You had plenty of access. Have very limited access, so we have tools like this, a stud welder gun. And what this does is you grind the paint coatings off. It has to be metal because it actually welds a little stud nail on there. And once that is welded on there, you can get a T-handle or a slide hammer, and that'll give you something to pull. And remember, as you're pulling on those lows, you want to tap on the highs. And also, sometimes it's hard to find the high areas. There usually is one, but even if you don't, go ahead and tap around it as you're pulling, because that will relax the metal and allow it to pull out easier without forcing it and stretching it. Now, I like using the T-handle for most of my pulling. That will repair most all the dents. There are some stubborn dents sometimes. It's a work hardened area that you're having problems with. I will get the slide hammer, but I kind of use the slide hammer as a last result, because it does have a tendency to pop and stretch that metal, which will give you high areas. Again, that's just preference. A lot of people really like the slide hammer, but you got to be careful using it. You don't want to pull and just slide, hit it as hard as you can, or you're going to have, stretched metal spots. I personally like using the T handle and a body hammer. Now you can see in this picture also there's a fender with holes in it. Now this is something that they used to do, and they'd use a slide hammer, but it'd just have a screw in the end. They'd drill a hole, and then they'd screw that into the metal, and they'd use a slide hammer to pop it out. But again, they have better tools today like this that tacks that on there. You don't have to drill holes, and it does a much better, cleaner job than the older methods did. But anyway, this is one of the most common tools, and I do have a demonstration on how to use this. The steps to take. And if you go to collisionblast.com/studgun, you can watch that demonstration and learn more how this works. And there are also other dent removal systems out there. This is real similar to the stud welder gun, except the electrode, it tacks it on there, and you do your pull, and then you just twist it a little bit and it comes off. So you use the same electrode over and over. This works real well. The disadvantage is it's more expensive than a stud welder gun. Uh, it's a little bit bulkier. It does require that you have somewhere to ground it, and you have to have it to bare metal. And using these methods that take it to the metal, bare metal, does bring on another concern with modern day cars, because these steels are thin, is when grinding, you do not want to overheat the metal. A grinder will overheat metal really easy. If you grind in one spot too long and it changes colors, you got that metal too hot. So what you need to do is keep that grinder moving so that you're not in one spot too long. And this goes for grinding your stud nails off as well. I wouldn't try to stay on one stud trying to get it completely smooth, or you're going to overheat that. It could warp the panel. So I'll go back and forth and alternate where I'm grinding, just like you would when you're welding. Keep that grinder moving around to prevent from overheating an area. Another thing a grinder can do is thin the metal. You can grind it too much, and that takes too much metal off. These thin panels, you take just a little bit of, off, you're going to have too much off, and it's going to weaken the panel. So you got to be real careful with how much grinding you do. One thing you can do with these thinner metals is removing the paint. Don't use a grinder. Use a dual action sander, a DA sander with 80 grit. It may take just a little bit longer to remove the coatings, but you don't take the chance of thinning the metal, and it doesn't heat it as bad either. You still want to keep that moving, but it doesn't heat it near as bad as a grinder would. Now when you're grinding off the stud welder nail heads, you're going to have to grind those with the grinder. Just be sure to keep it moving. Don't keep it on one stud nail too long, and keep it the metal. Try to keep it cool. And some of the basic body tools. You got body hammers, dollies. Those are used a lot. Hammers are used just about with any repair. With any dent removal system, I will use a hammer. For example, with a stud nail gun to tap in on the highs. Same with the other one with the reusable electrode, that system. So a body hammer you're going to use quite often. Dollies are it's just a piece of metal that you put behind the panel to, if you can get behind the panel to raise the lows. Now, one thing when using body hammers or dollies that you want to do is select tools that fit the panel. For example, if you're working on a body line, that third dolly down there, it's called either a wedge or a comma dolly. It looks like a comma. That works real well because it's got that sharp edge. If you're working on something real flat, you want to select a different dolly. So make sure that your tools, fit the area that you're working on. And I have a little video tutorial on that too, and you can learn more about hammer and dolly and the basic tools at collisionblast.com/dent repair tools. Basically, there are two techniques when using hammer and dolly. There's hammer off dolly and hammer on dolly. Hammer off dolly is used for rough out stages. That's where you put the dolly behind the low area, and you pull out on the low area, and you tap in on the high areas with the hammer. And where you're hitting with the hammer is not striking where the dolly's at. And you do this for your rough out stages to get the damage, close to the shape that it's supposed to be. So the dolly pulls out or pushes out on the lows, and the hammer taps in on the highs. And you do this at the same time. The other method is hammer on dolly. Hammer on dolly is used after the hammer off dolly method, and this is used for your final stages of metal straightening. And this is just to straighten out the ripples in the metal left behind. And this is where you put the hammer on the back side of the panel, and you hammer straight on the dolly area, and this flattens the metal. However, you got to be careful doing this, and you don't want to do this too much because this is stretching the metal. If you do it too much, you're going to stretch the metal, and you're going to have to do some heat shrinking, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But anyway, that's the two methods. Hammer on dolly also works real good for edges, like a door edge that is bent, to straighten that. Uh, you can also watch a demonstration on hammer on dolly at collisionblast.com/hammer on dolly. Body files. This is used to identify highs and lows and to level the top surface. Used to be used a lot for metal finishing, where they would shave off the top layer of metal so that it'd be flat and they didn't need to use body fillers. But thin metals, you're going to have a hard time doing that. But it does still work well for identifying highs and lows. Let's say you're working on a dent, you're doing some metal straightening, and you kind of get lost where you're at. You don't know where the highs and lows are at. Well, you can hit it with a body file, cross file it, and you can kind of see your file marks. And if it shaves, hits metal, makes it real shiny, that's a high area because it took more metal off. If you see there's areas that are no marks at all, of course that's your lows. Now there is another way of doing that. If you haven't removed all the paint and you're using hammer and dolly, and you can use a block with 36 grit on it to kind of help you identify the highs and lows as well, and that doesn't risk taking too much metal off. But anyway, it's just another tool for you to consider whenever repairing a dent. Also have a slapping file. Now I really like this tool. It works real well for your final stages. It's kind of a hammer on dolly method. You basically put the dolly on the back side, and this slapping file has teeth on it to help shrink the metal and keep it from stretching. And it's whenever the file hits the metal, it levels out any imperfections left behind. This method works real good. Again, this works better on older cars than on the newer ones, but I still use a very useful tool. Okay, metal shrinking. Anytime something's been involved in an accident and it got really stretched, you're probably going to have to metal shrink. And a good way to identify metal shrinking is when you're working on metal and it just pops in real easy. Chances are that it's the metal stretched in that area. It's also called an oil canning effect, and that's where it'll pop in and out real easy. So if you're having any of these problems, you're going to have to shrink it because you don't want to get your body filler on there and get it to where it looks just right, and then paint it and everything. Someone barely touch it and it pop in. So you're going to have to shrink that metal. And there's different ways of doing this. Oxyacetylene torch works real well. And that's where you heat the metal up to about a dime size, get it cherry red, and then you lightly tap it, to tap the high down, and then you get a wet cloth or wet sponge and you cool it off. Now this is the only time that you want to use water or compressed air on metal after heating it up like that. Normally when welding you want it to cool naturally, but whenever you're shrinking metal, that's what helps, when you heat something it expands, but whenever you quench it real fast like that, that helps it shrink, more than it expanded. So this is the one time that you do want to cool it off rapidly. You can use a wet sponge, compressed air, they all work. Anything that's going to cool that metal off fast like that. You can use a stud welder gun. They have attachments that you can put on there, and you can basically just put it on there and it'll heat the area up just like a torch would, about dime size. And then you follow the same steps. Hit the cherry red area, after it cools just for a little bit with the body hammer, and then quench it with a wet cloth or sponge or whatever method that you're using. But anyway, this is something that you got to be careful with. You don't want to warp the panel or overheat it. So this just takes some practice. So I just suggest to get a test panel, get an old fender that that's thrown away that you can tell has been stretched, that pops in and out, and even if it doesn't pop in and out, just practice that some to get that down, because you don't want to get on a car that you're working on and cause more damage than it started with. So this does take a little bit of practice, but it does work well. Okay, we're going to talk about a few additional repair methods. The first are kind of the basic tools, repair methods, and these are a few other methods that I wanted to mention, and a few other tools. This tool I wanted to mention because it is used a lot in a body shop. Very useful. If you got a door edge that's been in severely, or you're needing to align a fender. I mean, there's just a lot of uses for it. This is one of those tools that, whenever you start using it, you'll see more uses for it. But it's called the Morgan Knocker. Very good tool, and I have a link here to an affiliate partner here that you can get more information about that there. But this is a very handy tool to have. Uh, Another thing is the two-holer. Now this is going to be for bigger dents, because this is where you're going to have to drill a hole, so you can put pull force on it. I mean, you can hook a frame machine up to it or whatever you need to, and this works real well for roughing out a damage that's been involved in an accident, especially if you're going to be replacing it anyway. So this is another tool that I have found really useful in the body shop. Pull rods, I wanted to mention those. Those haven't been used in a long time, but they are what used to be used instead of like a stud welder gun. This is the alternative. This is my preferred method over the slide hammer. Kind of the same thing. You did have to drill holes, and you would put these in there. You'd pull out on the dent, and you'd follow the exact same steps as you do with what I'm talking about. You'd hammer in on the highs, pull out on the lows with that. Then when you was done, you'd use a solder gun and some solder up the holes, and follow them down smooth, and then apply body filler. But if you don't have a stud welder gun, this may be something for you to consider until you can get one. They also have suction cups. They work good for roughing out the damage. It's going to leave some of the damage behind. It usually doesn't pull them out perfect, but it will kind of help you rough out the damage to get it closer to where you can do the final straightening. And then PDR. PDR tools, they have a lot of different sizes of rods to get in hard to get areas. And PDRs, it takes some skill to learn. You're not just going to pick the paintless dent removal tools up and start performing that. It takes hours and hours of practice to perform. And the tools, they're not cheap. It's expensive. So this is probably something that you're going to have to want to go into this area specifically to get into it. But one thing you can do, I mean, if you have some of the tools that work good, to work in addition, work them. The tools get in some of those areas really good, and even though it may not be a paintless dent repair, it will raise it enough where you can just get in there and use body filler or glazing putty or whatever you're going to use. So they work well, but to get where you can remove dents without having to use any filler or paint, that's going to take a lot of practice and a lot of skill. But that is a well-used method that is used today on cars. And this is basically how the system works. You have to have a fulcrum point somewhere where you can put pressure down on the rod. And we're, in this diagram, we're using like a roof panel. And you can see where it's the dents on the roof, and it's pushing pressure up on the roof. And the fulcrum point is in the center, and that's where you'll hang it somewhere. And then the rod's coming down, that's where you'll push down. And you just sit there and work those dents, and it takes a long time. They spend a long time working those dents out, but you sit there and work it, and you finally get it to where it's it's perfectly straight, and you don't have to repaint the car. But again, this is takes a lot of work, a lot of practice to get this down. And that's just a picture of one of the dent removal tools. There's all different sizes and shapes to get into whatever area you're needing to get into. Now, what does work good, and it's not so hard, don't have to be so skilled to use, is these glue tabs. Basically, you just glue that on there. Then they got a tool that attaches to that, kind of like a stud welder gun. Have the T handle. Well, it attaches to that. You pull on it, and it helps pull the damage out. Now, these adhesive tabs, they work really good. You don't have to be that skilled to use those, and a lot of times, you can get the majority of the dent out with these. So those work really well. So that is the overview of dent repair. That gave you the fundamentals of dent repair, things to do first, how to develop a repair plan, how to determine to repair or replace, determine the methods used, the tools used, and if you'll watch the videos that will further explain how to actually use the tools, you should have a good understanding of how to perform minor body repair, dent repair. Now I do have a few tips for success for you. If you're a student attending a school, is to always keep safety first. I mean, I don't think any of us are getting into this industry or doing this as a hobby to get hurt. A grinder can, throw a hot piece of metal in your eye or whatever. So, always keep safety first. And another tip is to always listen to your instructor. Your instructor has years of experience, and he may or may not do things the way that I explain them here. He may have a little bit different approach, and that's fine. There's a lot of different ways to get from point A to point B. But you do need to understand that he has years of experience, and he's willing to share that with you, and you need to take advantage of it. So always listen to your instructor and do your very best for him or her, and that will help you do a lot better in the industry. And make mistakes out there. But always learn from them. Just don't make mistakes. Well, it's a mistake, and go on. If you make a mistake, step back. You're gonna have to ask yourself, why did I make that mistake? How can I correct that mistake? So always learn from your mistakes. Remember, the mistakes you make while you're at school is a mistake that you're not going to make out in the industry, and it's probably going to cost you money in the industry. So make the mistakes while you're at school. Use the school to your benefit. Use the instructor to your benefit. He's going to be there to help walk you, hold your hand step by step of the steps you need to take. You get in the industry, you're not going to have that. So be sure that you make all the mistakes and ask all the questions you can while you're in school, and there's someone there willing to help you. If he's an instructor, he's passionate about teaching you this information. So use that to your benefit. Ask lots of questions in the class and the lab, and that will help you better understand. And I always also like to mention is never think that you know it all. I don't know it all, and nobody does. This is a changing industry. It's changing fast, and there's always something you can learn. Always be open to new ideas. And it's like this saying: the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. That's by Donald Trump. He's a pretty successful businessman, but and it's really true. It seems like the more you actually learn about something, you realize, well, I really didn't know that much about it. So if you're asking no questions, that probably means that you don't know enough to ask the right questions. The more questions you ask shows your instructor that you're starting to learn. Whenever you start to learn enough to ask the questions, that's whenever you're going to be successful in this industry, because you're going to come away from this industry, knowing quite a bit of information. Don't be afraid to put effort into this. If you don't put effort in school, it's just going to be things that you don't know when you get out in the industry. Now, if you're a DIY watching this, same rules apply. I mean, you're not going to have the luxury of having an instructor to answer your questions and walk you, step by step. It's a little bit harder. You're just out there on your own. Only advice I have for you is, to read about this, watch videos, and practice. Don't be afraid to get out there and try it. Now, I may recommend finding you some test panels to work on. You may want to perfect your skills on that rather than your car, but just learn all you can by reading and watching. But you got to get out there and do too. And if you are do-it-yourselfer, I've also got a book that this video goes with, and it goes in more detail than I went in this video, but it takes you step by step. It has the steps in there of what to do, how to repair a dent, and you can use that as a guide. It's a Kindle, it's available on Kindle, but you don't have to have a Kindle. You can get it on iPhone. You can get an app for just about any computer where you can read it on your computer. But it's a good memory jogger. You can look back at step 1, step 2, step 3, which is going to help you, especially if you're not doing this every day. So that may help you if you're DIY to check that book out. You can go to this bit.ly/dent basics, and you can learn more about that book there. But anyway, whether you're a collision repair student or a DIY or whatever brought you to this video, I really appreciate you watching this video. I'd also like you to rate it and subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to collisionblast.com, and share this video with your friends. Again, thanks for watching. Take care.